Okay, break over. I'm going to show you some more about the etymologies, meaning the origins of words in English, and what it means for languages to be dialects versus different languages and how that happens, or at least a general idea of how that happens. So, again, I'm going to be using apes as my metaphor here. You might have heard that apes, you might have heard in my last video or anywhere else in your education that apes and humans have a common ancestor, and we don't know exactly what that ancestor looked like, but it was a good long time ago. And at some point, that common ancestor split into different groups, and those different groups evolved in different directions. One group eventually became humans, and another group eventually became modern chimpanzees. It's not true that humans evolved from chimpanzees because the ancestor was not a chimpanzee. The ancestor included the ancestors of both modern humans and modern chimpanzees. So they were not chimpanzees back then. And that's a relevant point for language because people say things like English came from German or English came from French. English did not come from modern German or modern French. It didn't come from French at all, but definitely didn't come from modern German. The ancestor language of German was not modern German, the same way that the ancestor language of English was not modern English. So we see here a skull that's probably something like the ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. And at the beginning, when these two population groups were starting to diverge, they could probably still, well, by definition, if they were not separate species yet, they could still mate and they could have viable offspring. Um, and when we say a species emerges, that means that they can no longer mate and produce offspring, because then they would be the same species, but they're not. So humans and chimps, I'm just going to rely on your common sense to verify this, but humans and chimps cannot have viable offspring with each other, the same way that separate species that appear to be close, like horses and donkeys or lions and tigers, also cannot have viable offspring. Lions and tigers sometimes have, but I believe their offspring are sterile, just like the offspring of horses and donkeys are sterile. Um, and that's what a species is. It's when those two populations cannot interact and share genes anymore, right? And something similar happens in languages. So when we say a language has a genetic relationship to another language, it's similar to saying that humans have a genetic relationship to chimpanzees or donkeys have a genetic relationship to horses. Um, and they come about in similar ways too. So the ancestor of both German, well, also Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and English is this language we call Proto-Germanic that we have no evidence of, but we have to assume existed because these languages had to have a common ancestor. Um, and when we say we don't have any evidence for this language, it means people did not write it down, or if they did, the writing did not survive. And of course, there's no recordings of it either. That would be amazing. If you had a time machine, you should go back and record someone speaking Proto-Germanic. I don't know where you would find those people, but they would be around somewhere. And Old English and Old Dutch would be similar to the populations of the chimpanzee human ancestor that later became chimpanzees and humans, respectively. Um, and that means that at the beginning, though they were in close contact and they were exchanging information with each other, communicating with each other, and they could communicate with one another. They were really, according to the definitions that you saw in a previous video, they were dialects, not languages at this point. They were mutually intelligible, which is our standard for dialects, right? But eventually, they grew apart and they lived apart for so long that they were no longer able to exchange information with each other, much like humans and chimpanzees can no longer exchange genetic information or lions and tigers. Um, and let's see, I don't know if this is going to be a helpful analogy either, but you know that different they're not species, different breeds of dogs can still mate and produce offspring with each other, which is how you get things like Labradoodles, right? Half Labrador, half Poodle. I almost said half doodle, half poodle. They're not separate species, although they look quite different sometimes. They can still exchange information. Um, English and Dutch are not like that. An English speaker cannot communicate with a Dutch speaker unless they learn each other's language, much like a dog and a cat cannot produce offspring with each other. Okay, so you see that along with English and Dutch becoming mutually unintelligible in a variety of ways, different grammar, although more similar than English is to French or to Spanish or Persian, um, and different words, different pronunciation. This word mother has also changed from what it was in Proto-Germanic to both modern English and modern Dutch, which neither one is exactly the same as Proto-Germanic. So you can imagine that English could have breeds, sort of like there are different breeds of domestic dog or domestic cat, if you prefer. Um, and these could someday become separate languages too, if the if the communities that speak these dialects don't communicate with each other for a very long time. Some natural amount of change could happen. They could find different needs for their language, and they could develop separately for long enough so that when a Scottish English speaker meets a standard American speaker in the year 2020, that's this year. No, 2200. Not this year. 2200, they will no longer be able to understand each other, and it'll be like an English speaker talking to a Dutch speaker now. If that happens, we'll call them separate languages. For now, because they can understand each other, although sometimes it takes some work, we still call these dialects, right? And the same goes for Singlish, which is Singaporean English, and African American Vernacular English, which is a dialect associated with an ethnic group rather than with a region. If that community does not speak to speakers of Singlish for a very long time, and they have no reason to exchange information or talk to one another, these could become separate languages to the point where they do not understand each other at all. But for now, they're dialects of English, just like you could think of Chihuahuas and Cocker Spaniels are dialects of dog, right? So, I'm going to introduce some new vocabulary for you, and you might have heard the word cognate in another video, or just from me using that word, but cognate refers to words like we saw in the last video that have a similarity because they have a common ancestor. So the Dutch word for mother and the English word for mother resemble each other because about 2,000 years ago they were the same word, and they just evolved different ways, right? So that's one type of relationship that words can have between two languages. But another one is a borrowing, which is taking an already mature word from a language and just inserting it into your language as it is, pretty much, with some modifications for pronunciation, but basically as is. So you see Dutch, this is meant to be a leaf, by the way, on the Dutch tree. This leaf, which looks like it would be hard to pronounce, but it's actually pronounced cookie with a Dutch accent. That word is the same as our word cookie. And English speakers borrowed this word from Dutch, I think about 300 years ago, and just started using it in the United States. Well, it wasn't the United States yet, but in North America to refer to baked goods that were sweet. And the etymology from Dutch is little cake, so that makes sense. And it's significant that this was borrowed in North America because they don't use this word in England. They use biscuit for those kinds of things. And this word did not evolve separately in English from a common ancestor. Okay, this word, as far as we know, did not exist in English. The closest cognate is actually cake in English, but English saw that Dutch speakers had this word for this little sweet baked good, and they just started using that word. It's not a cognate because it doesn't have a common ancestor. It's just a borrowing, and that's the word we use for this. We call them borrowings, or borrowed words, or loan words. The distinction between cognates and borrowings is especially important for the history of English because English has an unusually high number of borrowings. There aren't, let's see, there are a lot of words that we use in day to day life that go back to Old English. Most of the words we use the most often do go back to Old English, but a lot of words in English have entered just from looking at especially Latin and copying their vocabulary. And then also just because English is a global language, seeing what people around the world were saying and calling things and then just using those words for them. Sometimes for fashion, sometimes for a need, like if you see an animal that you've never seen before or a plant you've never seen before. And then sometimes just to have another option, right? When you talk about, let's say, say when you talk about a, a, a smart person, right? A person whose advice is respected. You can just say that's a smart person, or you can use this new word pundit, and there could be another word in English for that, like that idea of someone whose advice is best to be heeded. But this word gives us another option, and it sounds cool, right? So why not use it? So this tree we have here has leaves that are individual words that are all from other languages, including cookie. We also have skosh from Japanese, ketchup, which is probably from Chinese, although I think people are not sure about that. Pundit from Hindi, canoe. Canoe, I think, is from a Native American language. And tomato is definitely from the Aztec language, nahuatl, from via Spanish. So it came into English through Spanish, but originally from Aztec. And English has a lot of these kinds of words, and you wouldn't necessarily know it because a lot of them kind of go incognito and we don't notice them day to day. But if you look them up in an etymological dictionary, you can be surprised by what you find. So here the analogy to animals breaks down quite a bit. Animal species do not do this. They do not steal each other's features after they're both evolved separately. So a chimp cannot see a parrot's feathers and say, I actually prefer feathers to hair. I'm going to start using that. They cannot copy their DNA and replace their own genes with another species' genes unless they have access to genetic modification technology. So, like humans cannot steal full body hair from chimps. Chimps cannot steal human technology, and here's the analogy to animals really breaks down here because languages can have a genetic relationship, but then steal a ton of things from each other once they grow to maturity. But animals don't. Yeah, they don't do that. So, again, English has borrowed more than is normal for an average language, and it's probably mostly due to English's status as a world language combined with the fact that England was conquered several times during the history, the early to middle history of English, and that affected the language that people used quite a bit. I mean, the language meaning the words that people used. So on the right side of this tree here, you see these kind of light colored leaves. These are words that originate in Norman French. The Norman French conquered England in 1066 and made everyone who was educated or had contact with the ruling class speak French. So that left a big mark on English's vocabulary. We still use a lot of words of French origin, and like most borrowings, we tend not to notice them day to day. They tend to be more formal because they were more associated with, aristocracy and education. At the top of the tree, we've got words from Latin, so antique, acerbic, focus, but there are many thousands. And Latin did not, the Roman Empire did not conquer England after the Anglo-Saxons were already living there. This influence doesn't come from conquering so much as just from education and the fact that educated people had to learn Latin for a very long time in most of Europe, not just in England. From the history of the church, the Bible was only written in Latin for most of its history, right? So educated people had to learn Latin to read the Bible, and of course they learned a lot of Latin vocabulary in that process, and that left a stamp on English too. And these sort of darker green leaves on the bottom left are Norse words. And the Norse did invade England before the French did. So before 1066, about 200 years before that, the Vikings invaded and also they settled. They didn't just pillage and leave. They stayed and they set up shop and they started talking to people. And a lot of our vocabulary now still comes from Old Norse. Um, Now, if you looked at a pie chart of where the words in English come from, you might have the impression that English is mostly a Romance language because so many of their words come from Latin. So our words come from Latin, a Romance language, and or the origin of all Romance languages, and then from French. It adds up to almost 60% of our vocabulary. But that's if you're counting the words in the dictionary. It's not the words that people use the most. So the words like do or I or you or the ones that are in almost every sentence, almost all of those go back to Old English. But in a formal context, you'd be more likely to hear at least a couple French borrowings and probably some Latin too. So I'm going to give you some examples of a casual English sentence and then a formal English sentence. A casual English sentence, like you might text to your friend or just say, not to somebody whose opinion of you necessarily cared about that much, or you were just friendly with. And then a formal sentence that might be from an academic paper or something you might type in an email to a professor. So the casual English sentence here is get out of here. Get out of here. And if you looked up the etymology of each of these words, you would see in this very casual sentence, every word goes back to a very ancient period in English. There's only one word that's from Old Norse, but again, Old Norse is from about 800 AD. Or that's when English was still actively borrowing words from Norse. The other three words came over on the boats with the Anglos and the Saxons, the Angles and the Saxons, right? So very, very old. All of our pronouns, our articles, most of the prepositions, most of them, not all of them, go back to Old English too. And those are the words we use in almost every sentence. Now, a formal English sentence is a bit different because when you're formal, you're trying to put on airs to a certain extent. You'll reach for the high shelf vocabulary even when you don't have to. And that means sometimes using fancy words for words that have simpler synonyms. And that often results in using a lot of French or Latin vocabulary. So this sentence, the argument is replete with obfuscation. That sounds pretentious, doesn't it? Only three words in here are Old English. The, and then is, and with. And then the other three are either Norman French or Latin. And again, this shows the roots of English and the way that history has continued to affect the way that we speak. And I hope this video has been helpful for you to understand how English has diverged from other languages, but other languages have influenced English in its genetic relationship to them, but in also its many borrowings from them. Thanks.